Another of the wonderful things that our office gets to facilitate are the Global Learning Faculty and Student Research Fellowships. These are awards to faculty and students who are conducting primary research. It's mentored research with undergraduate students. And the model calls for faculty to bring the results back into the classroom somehow for engaged student learning. You're going to hear today from our two Global Learning Faculty Fellows who are about to embark on their research coming in this summer and in the coming fall. And then you're also going to hear with our student fellow who completed his research prior. So you're going to get a really good idea of the sorts of things, the exciting things that our faculty and students are doing to explore global issues through engaged research. And I would like to introduce to you our first presenter, faculty fellow Juliet Erazo in Global and Sociocultural Studies, and her project is called Globalization and Sustainable Development in the Rukullakta, that's one of the things she's going to teach us, is how to say that word. Indigenous territory of the Ecuadorian Amazon. It sounds exciting. Come on down.
Okay. Hi. So is this working? Can everybody hear me on the regular mic, or should I stand at the podium? I'm doing great. Okay. All right. So I have been conducting research in the Ecuadorian Amazon for the last 15, maybe 20 years now. And for the last 15 years, I've been working with this one particular group of native Quechua speakers in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Picture of some of them here. And since the 60s, they've been experimenting with different sorts of development programs, most of which have been funded by international organizations or the national government. And my research looks at these various programs and what sorts of changes they require of the indigenous people to engage in these development projects. So I look at these sociocultural changes and also kind of some of the tensions that sometimes develop between major development funders and the indigenous people engaging in their projects. So this is Ecuador, and that little box there you can maybe see is in the zone between the Andes Mountains and the Amazon forest is where Rukullakta is. It's a large indigenous territory. It's over 44,000 hectares in size, and it's a very biodiverse region. There are animals that exist in the zone that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And so it is the target currently of a lot of environmental programs. They're in the middle of a United Nations Biosphere Reserve, for example. So not too long ago, in the early 20th century actually, the main jobs that people in the zone engaged in were for white people. For example, you can see this one fellow here carrying a white person on his back in a backpack on a trip that lasted 8 days or more from this mission town in the Amazon to the capital city in the Andes, Quito. And the fellow heading the other direction is carrying mail, so they would go back and forth on these trips. Now, this seems extremely exploitative, obviously, but the good thing about it was that it actually enabled people to work part-time. So they would work for a few months, accumulate some money to maybe buy a machete, get some matches, buy some salt, the various things that they thought were useful. And then they would go back into the forest, into a second home, and live for 3 or 4 months without having to work for somebody else. And so they maintained a lot of the knowledge about the forest and how to survive there, and they maintained a lot of their cultural traditions through this kind of back and forth. Okay, so this started to change in the middle of the 20th century. The Ecuadorian government started investing in building roads into this region. They saw the Amazon region as a place lush for development. They sensed that there might be petroleum reserves there, and Texaco flew over the whole region and took photographs looking for potential sites for petroleum development. And the indigenous people were at risk of losing all of their land. So this one particular group I study got on board with this. They said, look, we're going to be modern ranchers. So we want to hang on to our territory. The way we can do that is by convincing people that we are on board with this modernization project. So they took out huge loans for cattle. They didn't even necessarily understand interest or the fact that you had to pay back these loans at some point in the future, but they got involved in this. And this required a lot of social changes. You needed someone to be in charge of the project. In the past, Indigenous people didn't really boss each other around. There was a lot more egalitarianism. So they had to elect leaders. These leaders had to manage debt. They had to manage work schedules for taking care of the cattle. And so I've looked at this over time. I have archival materials, and then also through interviewing the older members who lived there and their children now. And so these projects, not surprisingly, failed for a number of reasons, everything from not making debt payments on time to cattle dying because of snake bites and things like that. And so then there was a period of poverty. People were used to having some sort of income. They were used to sending their kids to schools. They saw that this was the way forward in their society, and so there was a period of suffering. Then in the 1990s and up into the present, there's this kind of new boom in sustainable development. So now I'm looking at a lot of these different projects and the types of cultural changes they require, because they tend to be smaller scale. They're not as lucrative. People don't earn as much money, but they still require changes in the way that people understand the environment. Just this whole notion of conserving a wilderness is kind of a new idea, you can imagine, as opposed to just living in the forest. And a lot of these projects are driven by very well-meaning people from the United States and Europe who are enamored with the idea that Indigenous people are communal and they all get along well, and that if we come in and build a couple ecotourism cabins, that they'll be able to figure out how to run a communal business. And I always tell my students, if you live in a homeowners association, and I showed up and said, look, I want you guys to run a store. You guys figure out who's going to work when. You know, if your best friend comes in and says, can you please give me this chainsaw on loan? I promise to bring it back. I can't pay for it now. You know, you need to make sure that nobody's going to do that. You know, so we can imagine how difficult it would be. Even our own society, even though we're used to kind of this idea of the separation between the business and other services, which they aren't necessarily so used to. So anyway, here are some pictures of these communal projects. The U.S. Peace Corps volunteer encouraging a women's group to grow non-standard crops like green peppers and tomatoes for sale. The Swiss invested in some communal fish ponds where they produce tilapia, which is a fish native to Africa, and it reproduces very quickly. So the fish tend to be small, but it supplements protein. The Germans came up with this idea of growing oyster mushrooms for export, and what they're doing here is sanitizing the soil. They're sterilizing the soil. So they have to heat up the soil in these air drums, oil drums, and get rid of all of the fungus and stuff that's in there so you can inject the mushroom fungus that you want to grow into the soil and have it produce mushrooms for sale. And then there's various forms of cultural and ecotourism. The Canadians helped one group build a cultural museum and then hope that tourists will show up and visit it. And they were able to make some arrangements with tour companies in Quito and get visitors periodically. And then ecotourism is everywhere too. You know, if you build it, they will come. Every community has their ecotourism cabins. So I look at these various projects, and one of the questions is, you know, why so much emphasis on community-run versus individually-run? And in recent years, there have been more of these kinds of individually-oriented projects too. There's one that was started by a graduate of Brown University, which uses a leaf from a tree that people typically use for tea, and it's now, he transformed it into a tea here, and now it's for sale in Whole Foods and things like that. So as part of this research, the students and I will interview various people who are participating in these projects. This is what I do when I go there, and the students will help me, and I'm hoping they'll give me kind of new questions to ask, a new perspective, a new angle to understand these processes. They might be wondering about different things that seem normal to me now, but are going to seem fresh to them. So look at people's experiences, compare to past projects. Can they imagine a better project? What would that look like? And then we'll compare and contrast these various projects that we'll see. In the proposal that I submitted to Global Learning, I set up kind of a sample, you know, of the 6 or 7 different things that we would look at. I told you about Runa, this tea company. Now, if you see it on the shelf, you'll know what it is. It's a tea company started by this Brown graduate, and they bring in tons of free labor, recent college grads to work in this organization and try to, they're trying to industrialize it, which is interesting. So it started off as this idea of most families had this tea tree in their front yard anyway and would drink the tea every morning. Can we create a global market for this tea, right? And now they have agricultural fields where they're sampling with various levels of shade, with various distances between plants. You know, they're creating a much more industrial type of project. And so we'll visit some of those agricultural fields. We'll talk with farmers who are struggling to grow the tea in these new ways that the company is telling them that they have to grow it if they want to sell to the company, and try to understand how these ideas of sustainable development reproduce some of the same scientific models that existed back in the cattle ranching days and things like that. You know, ask the students to compare and contrast. One of the components of this is I teach a class called World Ethnographies, and one of the units is on this particular part of the world. And so I'm hoping to produce a little film of this whole experience. One of the research assistants is actually from the journalism school and is actually good at making films and editing them afterwards. So that I can show that in the class and post it to the online class and things like that and add kind of another level to that. And then part of the project, I'm hoping it will work out. There's this one community that's been wanting to get involved in kind of a more educationally oriented ecotourism. They call it scientific tourism. And they've had a couple classes come down from Quito for just the day, but maybe have the students stay there for 2 or 3 days and try out some of the activities that the community is hoping to do with these tourists and give them feedback. So it's kind of this participatory, interactive research experience where the students will maybe try out going on a little rafting trip and then kind of interact, oh, it was too long, or is there, you know, those kinds of things with the people who are trying to get that project started. So they will not only be asking questions, but also kind of respectfully giving advice and providing their own analysis of what they see happening. All right, and thank you to Global Learning for this opportunity. One thing I'm hoping to maybe do is turn this into a regular short-term trip. So we'll be going for 10 days this time if it works out, maybe turning into a study abroad program to do during the winter mini-term semester as a kind of an addition onto my World Ethnographies class, an optional addition onto the World Ethnographies class. So we'll see how it goes. This gives me the chance to kind of experiment with something and see how well it goes. So thank you very much for that.
We have time for a couple of questions. Okay.
How did I start researching this topic? Well, when I was in college, I was actually an environmental studies major, and I went to my first master's degree was in forestry. And at that time, I started taking a few classes in anthropology, and my sense was that in environmental studies, it's often taught in such a way of like, let's go teach the farmers how to farm better. You know, we have the expertise, let's go and tell other people how they can do better, which there's a certain need for that, and I'm not criticizing it. But to me, I appreciated more in anthropology this idea of listening to people and kind of exposing some of these ways, different ways of seeing the world, and how something that seems so like such a great project in the United States, when you get to another place, is not going to work out the way you think it is because people have different understandings of the environment or different work schedules. For example, this cattle project, when the government envisioned it, they envisioned everybody working half the day, and then the other half the day for the collective cattle ranching. Then the other half the day you can do your own farming, right? Seems very rational. Now, for the people I work with, it didn't work out at all because they were used to taking 2 weeks to go visit their family in various other parts, for going on extended hunting trips. So the way they set up the schedule was everybody would work in these 2-week blocks, and they had to arrange everybody's schedule so that, you know, 10 people were out there all the time. And it, of course, was very difficult to arrange because nobody wanted to be out there at Christmas and nobody wanted to be out there at other times, right? But looking at some of these differences in culture and how much they drive these tensions in development and ultimately some of the failures that happen in development. So I moved to anthropology. But the Amazon obviously kind of came out of this interest in the environment and things like that too. Yeah?
I was just wondering how the interactions between the students and the indigenous people are mediated. Do the students speak Spanish? Do the indigenous people speak Spanish? I mean, or is there some alternative arrangement for these interactions?
Well, fortunately, I'm at FIU. And I was able to ask the students in the application, you know, what's your Spanish level? And I was even able to interview the students who had the most interesting applications to see if they really could speak Spanish, at least at a level that so they wouldn't just be, I wouldn't spend the whole time translating. And yes, most of the people I work speak Spanish. A few of the much older people do not speak Spanish, but you know, that'll be an easy, I don't think we would spend more than 5 or 10% of the time talking to people who don't speak Spanish. So that's the nice thing about the Global Learning Funding, is I got to be picky about the people I'm taking with me this time. If we turn it into a study abroad program, I'll have to kind of see if we can set up partners or something like that, come up with some way to make it work.
Thank you, Juliet. That's terrific.